So that's our mystery that we need to explain as economists, is why are some countries rich while other countries remain poor? Why is it that some countries that were rich, let's say Argentina at the end of the 19th century, which was the fourth richest economy in the world at the time, became extremely poor? And why is it that countries that are poor, let's say New Zealand in the 1970s, was able to actually become very rich? Okay? And that's the sort of the hypothesis that we need to explore as economists that gets us excited, and how we find the solution to this puzzle. And so we have a bunch of different hypotheses that have been put forward, all right, that I'm going to try to suggest are weak compared to the main hypothesis, which is going to be about economic freedom. So the first one is that the West is rich because the rest are poor. This is a consequence of the legacy of colonialism and slavery. Okay, and that is, sort of the argument that we built our wealth through the destruction of the colonial systems. Now, the colonial systems, there's no doubt that there's a real puzzle there and tragedy. But what happened is that the countries that were inhabitable, here's the sort of basic real intuition in this, that also explains why in Africa today there's discrepancies in countries, let's say Botswana versus the Congo. Like, why would that be the difference between those two different countries? And one of them is that, the countries that were inhabitable by Westerners imported those Western institutions. Okay? That's what their colonial governors did. Whereas the evidence is that in the countries that were not inhabitable, the rulers had a much shorter term time horizon, and they tried to grab as much of the stuff and exploit the population as much as they can. But those are costly enterprises, not wealth-creating enterprises. The ones that became their trading partners and the ones that they built on were the ones that, in fact, were the ones they could transplant their institutions to. And that's why they were able to cultivate, goods and services that were valuable to bring back. All right. The second hypothesis is geographic luck. If you happen to be born below the equator, life isn't very good. If you notice, even on that bubbles there, Africa still doesn't do so well, does it? Those are those blue dots. Right? It still lags behind. So one of the arguments here is that there's just a geographic luck distribution. If you happen to be born below the equator, you're not as productive as you are as if you're born above the equator. The intuition in that is simply that your workers are not going to be able to be as productive because of the way in which disease and sickness attack them. As opposed to, for the simple reason, in the north we get winter, and we kill pests during the winter, and you don't kill pests during the winter below the equator. You also grow your crops in water as opposed to in the ground, and that creates other kinds of disease things. This is a very important topic today because this is the argument why someone like a colleague from mine from the United States, Jeffrey Sachs, might argue that you need global redistribution to eradicate the discrepancies in income because they can't do it on their own. Because they have a geographic lock-in. Here's another thing that's a problem. Africa has less navigatable, has more waterways than any continent on the earth, but they're not navigatable. So they don't get the trading partners. So again, Sachs would argue we need big infrastructure projects. The problem with the big infrastructure projects is that our history of our attempts to do these things misunderstands how it is that infrastructure came about in the process of development in the West. Infrastructure follows development. It's not the cause of development. All right? As people get wealthier, trade moves away from the port cities further out, and infrastructure follows, right, from the ability to expand trading. It's not that if I built an airport in the middle of a country that all of a sudden people are going to come to it. All right, that's not going to be the way to address that issue. So again, I don't think that either the issues of disease or the issues of geographic location are the real explanation. The third hypothesis, which is becoming more and more talked about at the moment, is the relationship between IQ and the wealth of nations. And that is just whether or not you're lucky enough to be born into a society that has high IQ, being smarter or having greater cognitive capacity is more conducive to economic growth than not having that capacity. But again, all right, IQ is correlated with economic growth because it's better nutrition, better infant nutrition, right? That all leads up to the idea. So schooling is not the cause of growth. Again, schooling is a function of growth. Right? Wealthier and healthier societies expend more on schooling. Rather than, if I spend a lot of money on schooling, I'm going to get growth. Right? So a lot of times these things, they miss the causation because they're confused by the correlation to assume that something that's a consequence is actually the cause. Now we get a little bit more closer to, I think, where the real roots of economic growth and development lie. That is cultural legacy, which is religious and political ideological traditions. Now the reason why I say we're getting a little closer is because the religious ideas, what they do is they embed in us value systems that lower the cost of us engaging in complex interrelationships with one another. All right? A free society works best when the need for a policeman is least. What do I mean by that? It means that 99% of your transactions don't need someone to say, if you don't honor your contract, we're going to bring you to court. Because you would just honor your contract anyway. And historically, religion has been the communicator of those values. That's the main transmission mechanism of those values. And so we see in history a correlation with certain religious ideas. But it's not as clear-cut as people might think. So, one of the original mysteries that excited economists and social scientists in the 19th century, so this is not the 18th century is Adam Smith, 19th century is guys like Max Weber. And what excited them was the intellectual puzzles, also motivated by this diagram that I was showing you, or Hans Riesling was demonstrating with the bubbles. And that is, why no capitalism in China? If you would have been a Martian and came to the Earth in the year 1200, the most advanced civilization would have been China. And if you were a Martian and would have came to the Earth in the year 1400, the most advanced civilization would have been the Islamic Crescent. So the two questions that you're asking yourself is, why didn't China continue to be dominant? Or why didn't the Islamic Crescent sort of develop? Why all of a sudden did these barbarians from northwestern Europe become the first modern economies? Remember the 1820s or 1840s or whatever, he gave you the thing, he stopped and he said, who was here? Who was it? The United Kingdom and the Netherlands. Right? Amsterdam is the first modern economy. That's where the Industrial Revolution begins. All right? That's where you start having the takeoff. And so because of that, all right, a lot of people thought, and Weber promoted this idea, that it had something to do with the Protestant work ethic versus Catholicism. But as Rodney Stark and other theorists have written recently, that underestimates a lot of what the Catholic Church had done during the medieval period to, in fact, advance the development of science and whatnot that later led to economic development. We also see that in the Oriental countries that Confucianism can do the same thing that Calvinistic Protestantism did in the earlier period. We also have seen the rise of evangelical movements serving that same function. So we can't really pinpoint what exactly the source of the religion communicating this idea, except out of the idea that it lowers our transaction costs. And the political ideology that matters is one that, in fact, constrains or seeks to hold the rulers to the same rules that they want to have over the individuals. The rulers have to be bound by the same moral constraints that the citizens are. An ideology which claims that your politicians are outside of that moral standard has been associated with the poor and sick. But it's finding that the binding or the tying of the ruler's hands is associated with wealthy and healthy. To put it another way, you need a rule of law. All right? And you need non-discriminatory politics. Rule of law, non-discriminatory politics. And so that's led us to this focus on economic freedom. Policies like how secure are your property rights? Okay? How free are your pricing? Does government get involved in the pricing thing? Or are you allowed to have freedom of trade and freedom of association? All right? How individuals can enter into the market. You want a more competitive economy, you need more entry. And therefore, we also need to have prices telling us the truth, which means that we can't have inflationary monetary policy. All right? And we also need to be fiscally responsible in international trade. So now we know what we're looking at. We're looking at very specific policies related to the security of property rights, the freedom of pricing, monetary responsibility, fiscal restraint, and international free trade. A country, if you go on a website called freetheworld.com, it's about the Economic Freedom Index, you'll notice that the Scandinavian countries actually do very well. And yet that might run counter to your intuition of what you hear by journalists and whatnot. But the reality is that when you look at the objective economic policies of the Scandinavian countries, they're extremely economically free. They have very free trade, very low domestic regulation. They also have a tremendous lot of tax evasion. So they do have high taxes. They do have a very generous welfare system, though I should point out something, because a lot of people have a misconception about a lot of this, is that there's a new study out by the National Bureau of Economic Research by a man named Price Fishbeck, who's an economic historian. And what he does is he looks at the per capita expenditure on welfare policies in the United States compared to the Scandinavian countries. And it turns out that the United States actually spends more on welfare per capita. So we're not just talking about the fact that the United States is big and therefore it spends a lot, but its per capita expenditures on welfare are actually higher than the expenditures in the Scandinavian states. So one of the things that always has amazed me whenever you look closely at the Scandinavian states is, in fact, that there's a rhetoric and a reality. And a lot of people have failed to pay attention. This became extremely important during the 1990s in your countries, because when we were discussing about transition, what are we really talking about? A move from here to there, right? So think about transition. You want to go from one spot where you're at, which means that you really have to identify how that system operated. Not how it was imagined to operate, but how it really operated in practice. So you know where your start state is, and then you have to define where it is that you're going to. All right? So I just came from Prague down to Bratislava. All right? Imagine if instead someone had said, your start state's in Vienna. Right? I would have taken a totally different road. Right? Everyone understands that. It's very simple. It's the same thing if I don't identify clearly what the start state is for where you're reforming. And also, I need to know where the end state that I want to go to. And a lot of people thought that they could go to a Scandinavian welfare state system, and they thought it was the Scandinavian welfare state system that was in rhetoric. But one of the things that was often misunderstood in the early 1990s is all of the Scandinavian states went through a fiscal crisis not unlike the fiscal crisis that's currently going on in the pigs countries, what we refer to as the pigs countries, right? Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, right? So what's going on in those countries right now is they're confronting a massive fiscal crisis caused by an overly generous pension program and other obligations. Okay? And they have to come to grips with it because the bill has come due and they haven't paid it yet. Well, so did all the Scandinavian countries in the early 1990s. And I challenge all of you, go look it up. They all had to go through radical fiscal reform in the period between like 91 to 93. Because, for a very simple reason, in the 1970s, when they first started implementing a lot of their generous welfare programs, the number of people working, imagine a pyramid. Number of people working was a big base. And the number of people receiving was at the top of the pyramid, a very tiny place, or a triangle. What happened by 1990, that had been reversed. So you had an upside-down Christmas tree, right? With little people working, trying to provide for lots of people on the dole. That can't be sustainable. And they understood that, so they changed it. And they went through and they moved towards, right to center right parties and things like that were all going on. And somehow it completely escaped the intellectual imagination of a lot of people that were looking at things, and they still think that you can go in another way. Maybe that's not true over here in Europe, but it's definitely true in the United States. Jeffrey Sachs just published a paper in Scientific America maybe 2-3 years ago claiming that Scandinavia proves that F.A. Hayek was wrong. Because you can have socialism and have economic growth. And Jeff Sachs is wrong because he didn't look at the content of the policies. He only looked at the label that the politicians said was their thing. Okay? So we have to look into the economic content of these policies. Just to look at these world levels of growth, okay, so that this goes back to the same thing that we just saw on the graph. All right, so you can look at the countries that are doing well. All right, and then you can look at the countries that are not doing so well on this. This is the world distribution of wealth. And that's also the world distribution of how easy it is to do business. Okay? Take a good look. Here. Here. Okay, different colors, so you have to catch up a little bit. Okay? But the correlation is very tight. Alright? It's a very simple point. If it doesn't take you that long to start a business, more people will start businesses. Here's a little factoid that I used to use. It dates myself, by the way. In 1995, in August of 1995, the number of bankruptcies in New York City exceeded all the number of bankruptcies that took place in Russia from 1992 to 1995. Which was the more vibrant economy? All right, the market economy is a profit and loss system. Profit and loss. All right, I have a cartoon hanging on my door, which is from a cartoon serial that comes out in the United States called The Far Side. It was by an artist named Gary Lawson. Probably never would have heard of him. But what he has is it's a cartoon that says "First Business Failure," and what it is, it's a caveman walking away from a little kiosk, which over the top of it says "Porcupine on a Stick," and the caveman has a porcupine, and he's pulling the pines out of the needles out of his mouth, like he's not going to eat that anymore. He took one bite, like that. All right, that's how capitalism works, right? Is that people try out. They have, conjectures about what might be a better policy, a better product. They put it out, and if the consumers don't like it, then it doesn't continue to get put out. The tragedy, all right, in the developing world is that firms that should be put out of business are not allowed to go out of business. That's also true in the developed Western world. That's why we had a thing called the financial crisis. Okay? We created an environment for businesses in which we told them that they could privatize their profits, but socialize their losses. And then we were surprised when they didn't act very prudent in their investment portfolios. Okay? Let me, to bring this home to you, and I don't know what the particular rules of thumb are here, but when I was a young kid right out of graduate school, my wife and I had a 4-month-old baby, and we moved to Michigan. My first teaching job was in Michigan. And you know, I wanted to, I don't come from a family of wealth or anything like that. I come from a lower middle class family in New Jersey, as does my wife, so we didn't have any family to rely on to help us with anything. But I just, you know, I got my PhD. I got excited about economics. I decided to stay in school. People, you know, gave me scholarships to stay in school, so I did that. And now I was a professor, and I figured, hey, I'm a professor, and you know, I'm doing really well, and so I can afford a house. And my wife and I saw a nice little house that was a white picket fence house right on a pond in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. And we contacted a real estate agent. This is 1988. Contacted a real estate agent and said, hey, we'd like to talk to you about the house in Bloomfield Hills. She said, oh, come on in. And then as soon as we come in, she takes a look at us, and she's a little scant. We're both in our 20s. She's like, you know, what's this? You know, like that. And I knew nothing about buying a house. I had no clue what the rules were. And she explained to us that the rules were, do I have 20% down to give her, you know, as collateral on the house, down payment on the house? No, I don't have any money in the bank. And then she says, well, and then I said, well, what can I afford? She says, well, the general rule of thumb is you should never pay more than the, you know, 1 week of your monthly net pay. That should be your mortgage payment. So if you were making $2,000 a month, you should only, you know, pay $500 in your mortgage payment. That was the prudent rule. That was the rule of thumb in 1988. Fast forward 15 years. So we're now in the early 2000s, mid-2000s. I have a graduate student of mine, comes from very similar circumstances. He and his wife get married. They move to California. They live in the Bay Area in California, which is one of the most expensive places to live in the United States, near San Francisco. Okay? And he wants to go and buy a house. He has no money. He tells me, I'm going to buy a house. I said, oh yeah, you'll see what it's like. I wasn't paying attention. I'm an economist, right? We write books about money. We don't make money, so we don't pay attention, you know, about these things. So he goes off to the bank, and, you know, of course he has no down payment. He's making an assistant professor's salary, which is not, you know, enough. And he calls me up and he says, they let me buy a $750,000 home. I said, no, you can't do it. You'll be in debt the rest of you. You'll be horrible. You shouldn't do it. He goes, you kidding me? He goes, they're giving me the money away for free. He goes, I have 0 down payment, and they're charging me an interest rate, which is like 1%. And they're putting 3 mortgages together to give it to me. I said, what? All right. Well, now, the moral of the story is first of all, let me just tell you, my friend survived. He didn't get hit by the financial crisis because he sold before, you know, it crashed. So he sold at a peak, took the pocket of the money, and now was able to get a big house out in Boston when he moved to his new job. And in there, he, you know, built a beautiful bar and all these things like that. So he did well. So he still thinks I'm crazy for warning him because he timed it. He didn't know that he timed it. He just was fortuitous. But the question you have to ask is what happened in the United States banking industry between 1988 and 2005, such that my graduate student in a similar situation, in the 2 different things, experienced such a different world. And what happened was government policies. That's it. It wasn't like all of a sudden people woke up and got stupid. You know, hey, let's give the kids houses. We don't care if they ever pay us back, right? And it's not like a bunch of people went out there and bought houses saying, wow, let me buy a house for $1 million and I don't care if I ever pay it back, right? Yes, people did crazy things, but someone gave them the crazy juice, right? And that crazy juice was government policies. That crazy juice was provided by policies which gave consumers money for nothing and told them and encouraged them to spend it in housing. That's the United States manifestation of this crisis. The Federal Reserve engaged in a manipulation of money and credit and pushed interest rates below the market clearing levels, and the manifestation of that malinvestment was a consequence of a series of policies, okay, which were directed at making the United States be the highest percentage of home ownership in the world. That's what we thought we needed to do to be a vibrant economy. And now we're dealing with the consequences of it. And that has had big, issues. So the trigger here is the focus on public policy. We have to secure property rights, allow free pricing, okay, demonstrate monetary restraint, engage in fiscal responsible behavior, and have free trade. Now that argument is first found in Adam Smith. He laid that argument out. And then David Hume laid it out. And then in the 19th century, people like John Baptiste Say developed that argument, and Frederick Bastiat and John Stuart Mill. And in the 20th century, people like F.A. Hayek and Ludwig von Mises and Milton Friedman, my teacher James Buchanan, they all developed that argument. But there also became in the 20th century a counter-argument, as you all are very aware of. But not just the extreme counter-argument about the collectivization of the means of production, but also the counter-argument that said that we needed to steer markets, sort of the Keynesian-dominated argument. And the Keynesian argument has come back again in the wake of the financial crisis, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to sort of focus on these basic principles, because that, to me, is the battle again. The battle is no longer between, these grand big ideas about socialism versus capitalism, but instead about Keynesian management of capitalism, all right, and a more laissez-faire, rule-bound capitalism. Or another way to do it is politicians that have discretion, which are Keynesian politicians, or politicians who are bound by rules. All right, that's the big debate. It was the debate between Friedman and Keynes. It's a debate between Hayek and Keynes. All right, this is just, again, the Economic Freedom Index, in which you can see the drastic relationship between per capita income and the economic freedom that I'm talking about. See, here's the deal. Here's the thing that's funky about this. There's no unicorn. All right? So, the reason why we got screwed up in the 20th century, away from the Max Weber, Why No Capitalism in China story, was because, and you can even think about the languages that was used. We used to refer to, think about the way Weber put the question, why no capitalism in China? Why didn't he say, why no development in China? Because capitalism was synonymous with development. In 1900, to be developed meant you were a capitalist economy. To be undeveloped meant you didn't have capitalism. So, all of a sudden, something funky happened in the first 30 years of the 20th century. And that was called socialism. And then we divided the world up. What did we call the world? What did we call the developing world after World War II? What was his name? The Third World. Why did you get the name Third World? It used to just be called like the underdeveloped world. Why all of a sudden now is it the Third World? Where is the Second World? Here. This was the Second World. And the belief became that you could have development through socialist central planning. All right? So now what you had was a battle between the first world and capitalist development, second world and industrial planning. And they battled, that was the geopolitics in the third world, in the post-World War II era, was the first world and the second world, climbing over one another to export socialism to the third world. By the way, both countries did. Because we also believed that the way to get the development was socialistic as well. And that turned out to be false. So the reason why this Economic Freedom Index was such an important project, by the way, I should point out, it's the legacy of Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was the one who started this project on the Economic Freedom Index. He said, look, if capitalism is so important for these things, we should be able to find measurements for it. All right, we should be able to see the comparative measurements in the data. All right, and so what happened was you had the non-capitalist, non-developed world. All right, you had the first world, which was capitalist developed. You had the second world, which had claimed to have been very industrialized, and they were both exporting the model to that world. And then what happens when the second world ran into its crisis? It coincided with the reality, if you go back to the Hans Riesling thing, that the countries that were receiving all of these billions of aid hadn't grown. Africa and Latin America and India were the target of billions of dollars from both the socialist world and the capitalist Western democracies, and they hadn't grown. And so the question is, well, why didn't they grow? And the answer eventually became because they lacked the fundamental institutions that are required for growth, which is a private property market economy. So these components of economic freedom are going to be your security of property, as I said, your fiscal policy, which also raises the issue of scale and scope. What do I mean by that? The scope of government is the level of activities in which government is involved in. I think most of us probably in this room could agree that we don't think government should be choosing which God you believe in. Right? That's none of government's business. It also isn't in the business of telling you who you can marry. Right? That's not government's business. But you might think it's government's business to tell you that a school needs to be there rather than a park or a garage. Right? Or that what a factory could do. These are all questions about the scale of government. What is the proper role of government in a free society? That question is going to become more acute in your countries because of the pigs' countries. All of you in the Western democratic countries, which you are now a member of, the EU, are going to have to come to grips with this idea that you have governments that have overstepped their scope and their scale. And you guys are not even close to being as bad as, say, places like Greece or California. California is bankrupt. Right? Completely bankrupt. Michigan, bankrupt. Detroit has less people living in it today than it did in 1950. Okay? Now, how did that happen? These cities are bankrupt. These states are bankrupt because, recently we just had a big thing going on in Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, you could say, well, it's about public employee unions. I don't really have a thing with public employee unions. I mean, I actually follow the older John Stuart Mill recommendation about that. We could maybe talk about that in the Q&A. But the real problem isn't the public employee unions asking for benefits. It's governments who said yes to those benefits. The United States isn't suffering from a lack of taxation or a gutting of its public sector. It's suffering from an overly generous public sector. College professors, okay, me. I teach at a state university, George Mason University, a state university by the state of Virginia. College professors in California can retire on a pension of over $200,000 a year. Okay? In our public school systems, there's this massive rush for our teachers to become administrators for the last 5 years of their jobs, because the way they do the pensions is they give you the moving average of your last 5 years' salary. And that becomes then your pension, 80% of that. So what we have is in New York City, we have a situation where you can, in some places, you can have students in the classroom compared to the teachers. You have one teacher for 80 students. But if you actually had the number of people who were teaching, or were qualified to teach, actually teaching, the student population would be less than 20 students per teacher. Total administration, because that's in the incentive of everyone to move in that direction. So we're going to have these debates. In New Jersey, where I'm from, Governor Christie, who's kind of a gruff guy, all right? He's sort of a gruff guy. What I mean by gruff is he doesn't like mince words, okay? He tells it as he sees it. So he had a town hall, and one of the teachers said to him, you don't respect what I'm doing. And Governor Christie said, and she said, you don't respect what I'm doing. He says, no, I probably don't. There's a good job for you in New York or in Pennsylvania. He's the governor of New Jersey. All right, but we are all going to have to deal with this issue of how it is that we can, get government back in the bottle. Well, that's also what Portugal's going to have to do, Greece is going to have to do, Italy's going to have to do, Ireland's going to have to do. All right, I was in Ireland in the early 1990s when they were starting the reforms, and I was in Ireland at the end of the 1990s, and I will tell you the Celtic Tiger was real. They put tax rates down to 10% flat tax. They took a country that had less navigatable roadways than Turkey, and they turned it into a modern economy within a decade. But from the very beginning of those reforms, the mass group of politicians considered those reforms illegitimate. And and the group of intellectuals in that country refused to defend them. All right? And as a result, they started they started trying to take some of the benefits of that growth and become more and more generous. And now they're in the situation that they're in today. Ireland's not in this situation because of capitalism. They're in the situation because of government intervention into the capitalist economy. All right? And it's a very important thing to understand it. So we have these components of economic freedom. We have this experience that we have to look at. And we got to sort of break this down and look and see, what is it that causes some nations to be rich and other nations to be poor? The countries that follow economic freedom, those are the ones that are rich. The countries that don't follow the policies of economic freedom, those are the ones that are poor. All right? Now, I'll just end on this question of the mechanics of economic development and the debate that took place immediately upon the post-communist period. So if you remember back, some of you are old enough to remember, some of you are not old enough. But if you remember back 1989, when they had to transition away from the socialist economy and move towards that, what was the original economic debates about? So in the 1970s, let me just give you a quick thing. 1970s, Milton Friedman went to China. And they asked Milton Friedman, what's the secret to success of reforms? And Milton Friedman said, privatize, privatize, privatize. I want you to remember that thing, because I'm going to mention something about this in the end. And that became a mantra of people. But the way in which everyone understood that in 1989 was they needed to have macro stabilization and get the prices right. The problem with the economies was they were shortage economies. They were, in fact, macroeconomically imbalanced economies. So you had to come back and get the economies in balance and then get the prices right. So that's our first phase of the economic reform process, get the prices right. But as soon as we started focusing on that, we realized, okay, that getting the prices right doesn't just happen because I say so. We need to have all kinds of supporting institutions to enable us to get the prices right, which includes property law, contract law. Okay, that means you have to have a kind of a working legal system. All right, you have to have a sort of working business understanding. All right, these kind of things are, and so what we needed was a set of subsidiary institutions. Those institutions required not only for the economic life, but also for political life. You know, think about the old debates. Are you going to be a presidential system, a parliamentary system, all those kind of things, right? You have to answer those institutional questions at that constitutional moment. Well, as soon as we started contemplating those things about institutions, we had to recognize that institutions don't just stick wherever we want them to. Institutions result because of the history. We have certain path dependencies. History doesn't move in giant leaps. History moves in gradual steps. And so that's what led to the sort of debate about culture, the uniqueness of culture and cultural values. And so we've gone through the last 25 years of a debate that focused on prices, a debate that focused on institutions, and now a debate that focuses on values and cultural values and beliefs. All right, that's where the state of the art is at in economics at the moment on these things, focusing on culture and beliefs. One of my best studies on this, okay, not my best studies, but one of the funniest ones to read, was a study of corruption. I understand corruption is an issue that you guys talk about a lot. And so these two economists, in order to understand corruption, one of the things that they did was they looked at parking tickets at the UN. Okay? Because the UN people have diplomatic immunity. So they don't get busted for their parking tickets. So they wanted to look at the distribution of parking tickets. It turns out, by the way, if you're from the Netherlands, you never park illegally. But if you're from Chad, you park illegally wherever the hell you want all the time. All right? And in fact, what they found out was the distribution of parking tickets correlates almost perfectly with the corruption index. The more corrupt your car is, the more your diplomats just park wherever the hell they want. The more less corrupt your country is, the more they're not going to do that. And so we start thinking about, okay, so then how, that means these values translate over into various different institutional settings, right? And so the question is, how is it that we get at and unpack these things? So that's where we're at the moment. But for the state of where I'm coming from, and the message that I would like to leave you with, is to focus on this notion of that the 3 Ps, the mechanisms of economic development. So here's a very simple rule. Okay? You can only increase real output by increasing real productivity. Okay? You can only increase real output by increasing real productivity. And the way you increase real productivity in your economy is one of 3 ways. Improvements in human capital, improvements in physical capital, okay, or improvements in the rules that govern the interaction between individuals and between resources and individuals. Okay? So what is it that we're looking at, and what of those variables do we really focus on? That is the rules. And so we're going to look at 3 Ps that give us 3 Is. This is the mechanism of economic development. Countries that have secure property rights, freedom of pricing, and accurate profit and loss accounting get the benefits of high-powered incentives, quality of information, and innovation that comes from the lure of pure profit. Okay? 3 Ps, property, prices, and profit and loss, give us 3 Is. Incentives, information, and innovation. Without the 3 Ps, or attenuated 3 of those Ps, you will get distortions, and as a result, you'll get perverse incentives, distorted information, and lack of innovation. So that's how it is that we translate poor and sick and healthy and wealthy. Okay? If you don't get the 3 P's, you're going to be poor and sick. If you get them, you have this chance to go here. So this is this issue of entrepreneurship and the spirit of enterprise. Individuals being willing to bet on ideas and bring those bets to life. All right? That entrepreneurship is an act of radical dissent from the existing status quo. And so your society has to be able to tolerate that act of dissent and in fact not sneer at individuals who are making a living by engaging in commerce. Most of human history, by the way, we didn't do that, did we? When you read the Greek tragedies, commerce isn't what people like. There's no trader who's like the hero. The warrior is the hero, isn't he? Right? All the women who love Achilles. You don't like, Schleppy, like the trader, right? Who's like swapping goods. Right? He's not a hero to you. He's just an annoyance. All right, in those things. And so one of the things that we find is that when our culture shifted in the West so that we didn't sneer at commerce and trade, that's actually when we got the Industrial Revolution. We had a shift in values. We moved from the warrior virtues to the bourgeois virtues, as Deirdre McCloskey refers to it in her work. Okay? Let me just end with this. Okay? Adam Smith identified 300 years ago that mankind had a propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. A century before that, roughly, Thomas Hobbes had identified that mankind has a propensity to rape, pillage, and plunder. Okay? We do exhibit, our human history exhibits both of these characteristics. Whether or not we engage in rape, pillage, or plunder, okay, or whether or not we exploit and pursue the idea of truck, barter, and exchange is a function of the rules of the game in which we interact with one another. If we interact with one another in a world where taking is only possible because of giving, we will realize the benefits of social cooperation under division of labor and exchange and specialization. But if we live in a world in which taking doesn't require any giving, then you're going to end up by having those who have a comparative advantage in exercising the control over you running your lives. Human history is more dominated by the Hobbesian view than the Smithian view. What we need to do is find those sets of institutions, and that's the point of this book that you have in front of you, the set of studies in there, is find those sets of institutions which tilt that human condition more towards realizing the gains from trade and our propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, rather than succumbing to the predation of those who would want to be our political elite. Thank you very much. Yes.